This is TWiT.
When was that first meeting of music and a depiction of space, either in film or another medium?
Well, I think the first, depends on, you mean the first that I kind of conceived it or the first in reality, like in Hollywood history?
I guess let's go with Hollywood history, because obviously, orchestrations and music has been around for, long time. I think of Holston, the Planets, that sort of thing. But that connection to Hollywood, I think a lot of people have.
Hollywood kind of came second, I think. It really started, as near as I could tell, in France and Germany, didn't it?
Actually, very good. Because actually, not Hollywood, but film motion pictures, it's interesting. Film scores actually started well before the age of sound, before talkies. A lot of, a good number of the better funded films, silent films, would often hire composers to write dedicated film scores to accompany the films, assuming in the big film houses, those film palaces, you'd have orchestras playing along with them. Usually that wasn't the case, but this would often happen. And so one of the most famous examples of this was, it wasn't technically a space film, but it was a famous science fiction film that inspired many space films, and that's Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And he hired a famous composer named Gottfried Huppertz to write the score for this. And for the unveiling, the premiere of it in Berlin in 1937, it had a 66-piece orchestra, and it was heavily based on this kind of Wagnerian feel with leitmotifs and, trying to depict each character with different themes, including using like the French national anthem to represent the oppressed workers rising up, in this dystopian universe they created. So that's, another example was also probably the first space documentary was also done in Germany in the 1920s. I said 37. I meant 27 with Metropolis. I apologize. That was a year earlier. And I can't remember the name in German, but it was called Our Heavenly Bodies. And it basically showed human knowledge of space and physics at the time, with wonderful animation. It was great special effects for the time. And they hired another composer, an opera composer named Ignaz Waghalter, who had actually founded the precursor of the New York Philharmonic when he came over to the United States for a few years, but then moved back to Germany, take over as film composer. And so these started early on, although most of these scores have been lost. In the case of Metropolis, it only rematerialized in the last few decades. Most people had never heard of the score, right, and almost nobody in the United States had ever seen or heard the score accompanying the film, even in the day that it was out. So these were the first moments, but then, of course, it really took off during the sound era, when Hollywood started really doing film music, and the sound of space only really in the 1950s, and that started off with more of an electronic sound. And it started actually with a great score by a composer that Rod mentioned earlier, Bernard Herrmann, but unfortunately his score inspired some of the worst scores, for B movies ever made, with that theremin-y sound where you had all these rotten movies with that theremin sound.
There's good performances on theremin, and then there's just people that wave their hands around, which wasn't the same. I wanted to mention, lest we forget, I believe it was 1912 when Georges Méliès did From the Earth to the Moon, which was back in the era, if you were doing a score for a silent film, it could be orchestrated, but you really had to make sure it could also be played on a honky-tonk piano in smaller theaters, right? Because you got nothing but graphic cards coming up for the dialogue, and you got to have the guy playing piano in the theater, which is something my grandmother did years ago. And then we don't want to forget Frau im Mond, which I think was 1929, was it?
Things to Come?
No, it's Woman in the Moon, and that was a very late silent film.
Huh.
But I checked on it, and it was another one of these piano scored, in this case, there's some orchestration. But it was, I'd call it funky now, not for the time. I mean, for the time. This is getting off music a bit. I mean, basically, they're it's bad guys going to the moon to get gold, right? But the special effects were incredible. They had people floating in zero G. They had acceleration couches. They had wires and the whole thing on the moon, and it was very well done for its time. But the music was suffering. So, Chris, take us to what you feel is the first truly profound space score.
Well, there are two more than one answer to that. There is a definitive pivoting moment for film scores, particularly space, but there's like a couple major precursors to it. Obviously everybody looks to 2001, The Space Odyssey, with the actual use of classical music for that very effectively. And of course you look at television in the 1960s with Star Trek, the iconic theme there, and a number of other things.
And Lost in Space, John Williams.
Lost in Space, John Williams. They actually wrote two theme songs for that. The more famous one, the second one, were very effective. And so, I'll say a little bit about 2001, and it's interesting because there actually was a film score, an actual dedicated film score written for 2001: A Space Odyssey, but Stanley Kubrick tossed it out. Not Oliver North. It's not that up north.
Alex North.
Alex North. Yes. All of us now. I'm dating myself again by saying Oliver North.
Yeah, right.
Iran-Contra hearings. Okay. No. Alex North was asked to write the score, although Kubrick didn't actually want somebody to do it, but the studio thought they'd look cheap if they didn't hire somebody to write a score. And so, according to Alex North, he thought that, he thought his score was going to be played in the film until the premiere, until he was sitting in the audience at the premiere in April of 1968. And according to North, Kubrick said, countered that, saying that he knew, but this was obviously an area of tension between the two. But regardless, obviously we all know, all the famous usage of both the Strausses, not related, and Ligeti and a number of others within this film score. And he was very effective, but also effective of the long silences as well within 2001. We always think of the music, but how eerie it is when there's no music at all. It can really be jarring, and it's an interesting thing because often when you're watching film, even though it is, you don't have background music in your real life, it sometimes just doesn't sound right, literally, when you don't have background music, or it can create a very eerie feeling. And I think Stanley Kubrick did a very, brilliant job at finding that balance. But it also was something that may have inspired, it did, but he didn't do it, George Lucas. When George Lucas was was pondering the score for Star Wars, he had originally thought about, following the example of Stanley Kubrick. And he wanted to use classical music as well as classic Hollywood scores from, from the golden age of, from Max Steiner and others from the early days of Hollywood. But then Steven Space. Yeah, pretty much. And so, but Steven Spielberg actually convinced them to do otherwise. He said, "You've got to meet this composer that I worked with Jaws. His name is John Williams. You'll love him." And so they met, and and that's how it happened. Otherwise, Star Wars may have actually been following the same example of 2001: A Space Odyssey. But that gets me to the real definitive moment. 1977, May 1977, the moment Star Wars hit theaters. In addition to being a major milestone in motion picture history, it was a significant milestone in film scoring, not just for space films. As Hollywood had been, basically, orchestral scores had gone out of favor for a while. There were a number of good scores, but films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Graduate, others were not using classical scores. They were using folk music and other sorts of, other types of music. And so a lot of studios were less comfortable with big orchestral scores. And then comes this score that just massive compared to anything that people done for a while, with massive orchestra, London Symphony Orchestra, and just made such an amazing impact. It just, you can't imagine how many composers that are composing today were inspired by that moment when they realized what a film score could do. And it not only pretty much motivated a lot of film scores after that. Of course, after that, everybody wanted something that sounded like Star Wars in their space films, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. It also really revitalized orchestral music, public interest in orchestral music. Film music, particularly Star Wars, started being playing by major orchestras, and more people started going to the orchestra because of that. So it was a perfect pops sort of music, way to introduce people to orchestral music, in an approachable way. So, the impact of that's still going on. Of course, John Williams is still writing music. We have a lot of great composers now that are exploring new territory. But that moment, you can't think of any other moment in film scoring history that had as big an impact, particularly for space films.
I have one moment, perhaps, that could have had that big an impact. It's a bit of trivia, but back in the 90s, I was married to the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and I met Jerry Goldsmith about the same time I was working on Deep Space Nine. So I told him I was a huge fan of his music and loved what he had done for Planet of the Apes, and of course the Star Trek Overture and all that. And then he told me how frustrated he had been when he was writing. So, he wrote the second great Star Trek theme, right? The big one, the big brassy one. It was originally executed as a jazz piece. Did you ever hear the jazz version?
Oh, tell me you have a sample of that.
I don't have it. We'll bring it another time, but it was ta, 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 ta. It was horrible beyond description. And I thought, how could such a brilliant guy write something so deplorable? Sorry, in your memory, Jerry, I don't mean to besmirch you, but it just made my skin crawl off my body. It was. Yeah,
I didn't hear it, but I heard the stories. And, Robert Wise, who directed the original Star Trek, who also did also The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Right.
And I forgot who the other guy was. May have been Bob Justman.
But Wise looked at him and said,
Yes, and I think you need to go back and do this. He went back, brought back the original, and said, so why didn't you write this one before? So.
Hey, if you enjoyed this clip, be sure to check out This Week in Space. You can find us on your favorite podcast app or see the link in the description below. See you there.